"Repeat that," Dominic Rossi said, and he was smiling, which was somehow worse than if he'd been angry. Elise Hartman's hand was still shaking around the coffee pot she'd just set down too hard, the German curse still hanging in the air between them, low and fast, meant for no one but herself. She hadn't meant for him to hear it. She hadn't meant for any of this, the ruined shift, the shattered mug, the man in the tailored coat who owned half the block she worked on, sitting 3 feet away with an expression she couldn't read. "I don't know what you think you heard," she said, reaching for a rag, refusing to look at him. "I heard exactly what I think I heard." Dominic leaned back in the booth, unhurried, the way men who had never once been told to hurry always were. "I just want you to say it again. This time, look at me." Somewhere behind the counter, the espresso machine hissed. Somewhere in Elise's chest, something that had been coiled tight for 11 months, since the visa, since the debt, since the reason she'd left Munich in the first place, pulled 1 degree tighter. To understand how a Chicago cafe ended up hosting this particular standoff, and how the man everyone in 3 zip codes called Mr. Rossi ended up grinning at a waitress who had just cursed him out in a language he wasn't supposed to understand, we have to go back 6 weeks, to the night Elise Hartman walked into the Copper Kettle for her very first shift. Elise Hartman had a habit her mother used to scold her for. She talked to herself when she was overwhelmed, and she talked to herself in German, because English still felt like a coat that didn't quite fit, something she wore carefully in public, and shed with relief the moment she thought no one was listening. She had come to Chicago 9 months ago on a student visa that had quietly expired 4 months in, after the university program she'd enrolled in folded mid-semester amid a funding scandal that made the local news for exactly 1 cycle and then vanished, leaving 40 international students with unfinished degrees and very few good options. Elise's options had narrowed to this: stay illegally and work under the table, or go home to Munich and the crushing weight of a family that had sold a small piece of land to send her here in the first place. She chose to stay. She chose the Copper Kettle, a narrow, overworked cafe on a corner in the Gold Coast that ran 16 hours a day and paid cash, no questions, which was precisely the arrangement Elise needed, and precisely the arrangement that made her feel, some nights, like she had smuggled herself into her own life. "You mutter," said Renata, the cafe's day shift lead, a sharp-tongued Brazilian woman who had clocked Elise's whole situation within a week and never once mentioned it out loud, which Elise understood as its own kind of kindness. "Every time an order goes wrong, you mutter in German like it's a magic spell. It helps," Elise said. "No one understands it. I can say anything. One day someone's going to understand it," Renata said, "and you're going to have a very bad 5 seconds." Elise laughed it off, because the idea seemed impossibly specific. Who, in this particular corner of Chicago, would ever recognize German muttered under a barista's breath at 7 in the morning? There was a man who came in most afternoons around 3, always alone, always ordering a double espresso he drank standing at the counter rather than sitting, like a man who didn't quite trust chairs. He wore suits that fit too well for the neighborhood, said almost nothing beyond his order, and left tips that made the other baristas go quiet and glance at each other in a way Elise found strange, but didn't ask about. She had no idea his name made grown men change which side of the street they walked on. She had no idea that Renata and the cafe's owner had both recognized him within seconds of his first visit, and had spent every shift since treating him with a careful, wordless deference that Elise, distracted by her own unraveling paperwork and her own muttered German curses, had simply never noticed. She had no idea any of this was about to matter. Dominic Rossi controlled logistics on the North Side the way other men controlled companies, quietly, thoroughly, and with a personal rule that had kept him alive 14 years past the point most men in his position expected to die. Trust nothing that can't be verified twice. He had learned that rule the hard way, watching his own uncle go down, because he trusted a driver who'd been flipped by federal agents 18 months before anyone noticed the pattern in his routes. Dominic had rebuilt what his uncle lost with a colder, more exacting version of the same operation, and he had done it by assuming, as a baseline, that everyone around him was performing loyalty rather than living it. "You go to that cafe every day," his second, Marco Del Vecchio, said to him once, not entirely as a question. Marco had run alongside Dominic for 9 years, since the messy transition after his uncle's fall, and had earned the kind of trust Dominic rationed like water in a drought. "Coffee's good," Dominic said. "Coffee's the same coffee you could have delivered to the office." Dominic didn't answer, because Marco wasn't wrong, and Dominic had never enjoyed being predictable, even to himself. The truth was smaller and stranger than he wanted to examine too closely. At the copper kettle, wedged between the register and a rack of pastries no one ever finished, there was a barista who muttered to herself in German every time a ticket printed wrong, unaware that Dominic understood every word. His mother had been born in Stuttgart, and German had been the language of his childhood kitchen before it was anything else. He had listened to this woman curse out difficult customers, curse out the milk steamer, curse out, memorably, an entire batch of oat milk that had gone off in a low, rapid mutter she clearly believed was private. It had become, without his quite noticing when it started, the best 40 minutes of his day. "She doesn't perform for me," he thought, more than once, watching her snap at a rude customer in English and then exhale her real fury in German half a second later, believing herself unheard. "Everyone performs for me. She just doesn't know there's an audience. No one gets close enough to use it against me later." That was the rule Dominic had built his adult life around, and it had never once felt fragile, until a barista's private, muttered honesty started to feel like the only unguarded conversation in his week. It happened on a Tuesday. During the dinner rush the cafe wasn't built to handle, when a grease fire caught in the back kitchen and turned a bad night into a genuine emergency in under 90 seconds. Smoke rolled out from the kitchen door thick and fast. The evening cook, new and panicked, froze with a fire extinguisher in his hands, aiming it at nothing. Customers scrambled for the door. Renata, off that night, wasn't there to take charge, and the cafe's owner was 2 states away visiting his sick father. Elise moved before she decided to move. "Pull the extinguisher pin, aim at the base, not the flame," she snapped at the cook in rapid, clipped English, already grabbing a second extinguisher from the wall mount, years of a long-forgotten summer job at a Munich restaurant surfacing in her hands before her brain caught up. "Everyone out front, now, leave your bags." She hit the fire at its base exactly as she'd instructed, foam swallowing the flame in a controlled burst, smoke thinning within seconds as the cook, following her lead, finished the job with his own extinguisher. The whole thing was over in under 2 minutes, the kind of contained, competent handling that turned a potential disaster into a mess for the fire department to shrug at when they arrived. Dominic, still standing at the counter where he'd been when it started, hadn't moved through any of it, not out of indifference, but because he'd been watching Elise work with the same still intensity he brought to reading a room full of armed men. No panic, no hesitation, no performance for the small crowd now murmuring outside on the sidewalk. When it was over, Elise straightened, breathing hard, soot on her sleeve, and immediately reverted to muttering. Quiet, rapid German, half relief, half fury, at the cook, at the extinguisher, at the entire evening. "Gott im Himmel, wenn ich diesen Idioten nicht rausziehe, brennt der ganze Laden ab." "He's not an idiot," Dominic said, in flawless German, quiet enough that only she heard it. "He's 22 and terrified." Different problem. Elise went very, very still. She turned to face him slowly, color draining and then rushing back into her face in the space of a single breath. "You speak German," she said, in English, as though saying it aloud might make it untrue. "My mother's from Stuttgart," Dominic said, and there was something almost gentle in how carefully he said it, watching her recalculate every private word she'd ever let slip in front of him. "I've heard you curse out the milk steamer in German for 6 weeks. It's the highlight of my Tuesdays." Elise's mortification arrived in stages. First, the memory of what she'd said about difficult customers. Then, what she'd said about the espresso machine. Then, worse, what she'd occasionally muttered about him specifically, about the 2 good suits and the tips that felt like a test she didn't understand the rules of. "That's an invasion of privacy," she said. English clipped now, defensive. "You said it out loud, in a public cafe, repeatedly." Dominic almost smiled. "I'm not sure that qualifies as private." It was 3 weeks later, another difficult shift, another muttered curse. This one aimed squarely and specifically at him for a comment about her accent she'd taken the wrong way. That led to the moment neither of them fully planned. Elise set the coffee pot down too hard, cursed under her breath, in rapid, furious German, certain as always that the words would dissolve into the espresso steam unheard. Repeat that, Dominic said, and he was smiling. This time, look at me. Elise's hand was still shaking around the coffee pot. I don't know what you think you heard. I heard exactly what I think I heard. You're insufferable, she said finally, in German, meeting his eyes deliberately this time, chin lifted, daring him to react. There it is, Dominic said, genuinely delighted, and something in his chest that had been locked for 14 years turned over, unfamiliar and warm. Say it in English now. I want to hear you mean it both ways. You're insufferable, Elise repeated, in English. And to her own considerable surprise, she was almost smiling too. Marco Del Vecchio noticed the change in Dominic before Dominic admitted it to himself. The extra 10 minutes at the cafe that stretched into 30. The way Dominic started arriving in a mood that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with anticipation. You're spending real time on this, Marco said, careful, the way a man who has served someone for 9 years learns to be careful, not smart, with your name. People notice a pattern. People use patterns. Noted, Dominic said, which was as close as he came to admitting Marco was right. What neither of them accounted for was Elise noticing something too, the way one particular supplier, a wiry, nervous man named Teo Bianchi, who delivered coffee beans twice a week, had started asking her small, oddly specific questions on his visits. When Mr. Rossi usually came in, whether he came alone, whether the cafe had a back entrance he used. At first she dismissed it as small talk from a chatty vendor. Then, 3 visits in, Teo asked something that snagged in her memory precisely because of how carefully casual it sounded, whether Dominic ever discussed business at the cafe, and whether Elise ever overheard any of it. She mentioned it to Dominic on a slow afternoon, half joking. Your coffee supplier is very curious about your schedule. Dominic's espresso stopped halfway to his mouth. What kind of questions? When you come? If you're alone? If there's a back door? Elise shrugged. Maybe he's just nosy. I don't know how any of this works. Keep noticing, Dominic said in German, quiet and serious now, and something in his face told her this wasn't small talk anymore. It happened by accident, the way these things always seem to, 3 nights later, when Elise stepped into the alley behind the cafe to break down cardboard boxes near the end of closing. She heard Teo's voice first, low and urgent, on a phone call he clearly believed was private. Thursday, when he does the supply drop-off himself, that's the window. He always comes alone for that one. No Marco, no driver. Cassano's people move in from the loading entrance the second he's inside checking the delivery. Clean. No witnesses in the alley that time of night. A second voice, tinny through the phone speaker, asks something Elise couldn't make out. The barista? She doesn't know anything. She's basically illegal. She's not going to the cops about anything. Ever. If she notices, she's got more to lose than we do. Elise stood frozen behind a stack of flattened boxes, heart slamming. The German phrase she wanted to scream dying silently in her throat. Thursday. The delivery. The loading entrance. She thought of Dominic's ridiculous, delighted grin the day he'd caught her cursing at him in German. She thought, with sudden cold clarity, of Teo's careful, friendly questions she'd waved off as nothing. This is not my problem, she told herself, backing slowly away from the wall, and then, immediately, knew that it was. She finished her shift on shaking legs, and the moment it ended, went looking for the one number she had for anyone connected to Dominic, Marco's, scrawled on a receipt after he'd once paid for a round of coffees for the whole late shift. Dominic listened to Elise's account twice through, his face unreadable, before he spoke. You're certain it was Teo's voice? He's delivered our coffee twice a week for 6 weeks, Elise said, still cold from the alley, still shaking. I know his voice. Dominic went quiet in a way that made Marco, standing nearby, take an instinctive step back. Then he made 3 calls, low and precise, rebuilding Thursday's supply drop from the ground up, without revealing to anyone outside Elise, Marco, and 2 trusted men exactly why. You're not anywhere near that loading dock Thursday, Dominic told her, flat and final. I wasn't planning to be, Elise said, but I wasn't going to sit on this either. If something happened to you and I'd said nothing, I don't think I forgive myself for that. Not ever. Thursday night, the loading dock sat quiet under a single working streetlight, exactly as Teo had described it to whoever was listening. Except Dominic arrived, flanked by men Cassano's people weren't briefed to expect, and Teo himself, waiting nervously by the delivery van, found not an unguarded boss, but Dominic Rossi, standing calmly in the center of the dock, waiting for him. Dominic, Teo started, composure cracking immediately. This isn't, save it, Dominic said, voice even cold in the specific way that had kept him alive 14 years. I know about Cassano. I know about Thursday. I know about the loading entrance. He let the silence stretch. What I want to know is what they offered you that made 6 weeks of friendly small talk with my barista worth this. There was no gunfire. There was, instead, something colder. Dominic laying out, in flat, unhurried detail, everything his people had quietly confirmed in the 4 days since Elise's warning, until Teo had nothing left to argue with except the wreckage of his own choices. You get to walk away, Dominic said finally. That's the only mercy this earns you. But you're done in this city. If Cassano sends you again, the mercy doesn't repeat. Word moved through Dominic's world the way it always did. Not the details, but the shape of it. A supplier who'd tried to set up a hit, and a barista whose sharp ears had stopped it cold. When Dominic walked into the copper kettle the following Monday, Renata treated Elise with a new, careful respect she didn't fully explain, and didn't need to. You could have said nothing, Dominic told her quietly, once the cafe had emptied out. You'd known me 6 weeks. You had every reason to stay out of it. I knew enough, Elise said. I knew the man who speaks German to his mother's memory and grins like an idiot when a barista curses him out in it. That was enough to know you didn't deserve what Teo was planning. Dominic reached across the counter, resting his hand near hers, not quite touching, close enough that the gesture spoke plainly enough on its own. I've spent 14 years assuming the moment someone really knew me, they'd use it, he said. You knew the realest, most unguarded version of me before you knew anything else. You just never used it against me. You used it to save my life instead. I still don't fully know what you do, Elise said, a tired smile breaking through. And, honestly, Dominic, I'm not sure I want the detailed version over espresso at 3 in the afternoon. He laughed, low, real, the kind Marco later admitted he hadn't heard from Dominic in years. Weeks later, Elise's immigration attorney called with news that made her sit down hard on the cafe's back steps, a pathway forward on her status. Complicated and slow but real. The first genuinely solid ground she'd stood on in 9 months. She called her mother in Munich first, laughing and crying in a tangle of German that made sense to no one but the two of them. Then, hesitant, she called Dominic. He showed up that evening with a bottle of wine and, unexpectedly, Renata and Marco in tow, having apparently coordinated a small, loud celebration that spilled out of Elise's tiny apartment kitchen and into the hallway, her neighbor eventually wandering in simply because the noise was too warm to resist. To staying, Dominic said, raising his glass, and the word landed in Elise's chest exactly where she needed it to. Later, once everyone had gone, Dominic lingered by her door, uncharacteristically unsure of himself. I don't have a map for this part, he admitted. Being someone's plainly without calculating what it costs them. I've spent so long assuming closeness gets people hurt. Then we build the map, Elise said. One shift, one hearing, one ridiculous grin at a time. I didn't leave everything behind in Munich to be scared off by a learning curve now, Dominic smiled. The same delighted, unguarded grin from the day she'd cursed him out in German and he'd asked her to say it again, looking at him. And for the first time in 14 years, trust didn't feel like a rule he had to enforce. It felt like something he'd found by accident, muttered under someone's breath, meant for no one but herself. Until it wasn't. If Elise's sharp tongue and Dominic's slow-earned trust got to you, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments. Did you catch Teo's game before the loading dock scene? Or did his betrayal blindside you completely? Stay close, because Cassano isn't finished and part 2 is already loading.